The silver pin struck the divorce papers twice. Then Julian Hargrave pushed the resignation letter across the polished table as if 10 years of Evelyn Vance's life could be reduced to one signature. Evelyn stood in a brilliant crimson silk power suit, every inch of her still and precise, while Julian faced her in a charcoal black executive tuxedo, his posture arranged like a man posing for a throne he had not earned. Behind him, Chloe Beaumont waited in an ivory-laced dress, soft-eyed, pale, and already leaning toward the chair from which Evelyn had built her career. The cruel reality arrived without mercy. Julian was forcing his wife to sign away her marriage and her COO seat in the same breath, replacing the woman who ran his shipping empire with a socialite who did not know the difference between a birth and a bill of lading. Evelyn looked at the papers. She did not cry. Something colder opened behind her eyes. Not grief, not panic, but calculation. "Is this your final decision?" she asked. Julian let the question hang because he wanted witnesses to hear him sound absolute. Around the Port Authority conference room, the glass walls reflected maps of cargo lanes, dock schedules, harbor depths, rail links, and warehouse routes stretching across Manhattan like veins under steel skin. For 10 years, Evelyn had read that system better than any man in the room. She knew which tide window saved a ship 2 hours. She knew which refrigerated warehouse could protect $40 million in pharmaceuticals during an 82-degree weather delay. She knew which mile of private access road mattered more than a dozen luxury offices. Julian knew none of it, but his insecurity had learned how to wear confidence. "You have been a remarkable steward," he said, making the words sound like a demotion. "But Hargrave Global Logistics needs a public face with warmth, elegance, and modern appeal. Chloe understands the future." Chloe lowered her lashes, performing humility for the board, but her hand already rested on the back of Evelyn's chair. Evelyn noticed that first. Then she noticed the second betrayal. Through the window behind Julian, workers were removing the old Vance crest from the harbor entrance, the crest her father had placed above the gates before Julian ever owned a single vessel. In its place, a wrapped ivory sign waited on a steel cart. Chloe's name was printed beneath a gold ribbon. Evelyn's breath stayed even. That quiet steadiness unsettled the room more than anger would have. The senior port lawyer shifted his folder. The harbor master stopped looking at Julian and looked at Evelyn. Julian mistook silence for defeat because men like him often confuse volume with power. "Sign, Evelyn," he said. "Leave with dignity." She picked up the pen. The room seemed to lean toward her hand. First, she signed the divorce papers. Then she signed the COO resignation. Julian's mouth tightened with satisfaction, but Evelyn had already moved her left hand to the object beside her portfolio, the Midnight Navy Master Manifest with red gilded edges, closed, heavy, and older than his company charter. Julian saw a book. Evelyn saw docks, cranes, access roads, berth permissions, cold storage, customs corridors, and every legal path his empire used to touch land. She slid the signed papers back to him. "You now have exactly what you asked for." Chloe's expression brightened too early. Julian reached for the documents as if they were a crown. Evelyn did not let go of the manifest. She turned to the senior port lawyer and spoke with the calm of someone reading a tide chart before a storm. "Prepare the heritage use review." The lawyer's eye sharpened. Julian's fingers paused over the signature line. "What review?" Evelyn lifted the manifest from the table, and the red gilded edges caught the light like a sealed verdict. "The one you never bothered to read." No one moved. Outside, the first section of the Vance crest came down from the harbor gate, but Evelyn no longer looked wounded by it. She looked finished. She looked free. She walked past Chloe without giving her the dignity of a glance, past Julian without waiting for permission, and into the corridor that led toward the docks. Behind her, the room remained full of powerful people who had just realized the woman being dismissed was the only person who knew where the empire actually touched the shore. Evelyn did not speed up when the conference room door closed behind her. The corridor outside the Port Authority office ran nearly 200 feet toward the harbor elevators, lined with framed photographs of vessels Julian loved to claim as proof of his genius, though every route, every berth, every access window had been calculated by Evelyn long before those ships carried his logo. Her crimson silk suit moved like a blade of color against the gray steel walls, too bright to be swallowed by the industrial cold around her. "Send the first notice," she said. The quiet assistant beside the elevator lowered her tablet with both hands, already understanding that the marriage had ended, but the war had not begun in public yet. Evelyn opened the Midnight Navy Master Manifest with red gilded edges, not dramatically, not for display, but with the care of someone handling a living map of power. Its pages held more than schedules. They held restricted use permissions, ancestral dock grants, private rail easements, customs corridor agreements, refrigerated storage priority rights, crane allocation clauses, and old harbor covenants that Julian had dismissed as family paperwork because he only respected documents with his own name at the top. That had always been his weakness. He believed ownership was a title, not a chain of enforceable permissions. Evelyn placed one finger on the first tab. Vance birth access. Suspend conditional courtesy use. The quiet assistant typed the order and sent it to the senior port lawyer. 30 seconds later, the legal notice began moving through secure channels, not with spectacle, but with the precision of a lock turning inside a vault. Inside the conference room, Julian was still collecting signatures and congratulations. He believed Evelyn's silence had protected his dignity. He did not understand it had protected her timing. Chloe stood near Evelyn's old chair while a board member described media positioning, and she nodded as if elegance could replace port literacy. Julian adjusted his cuffs, satisfied by the sight of the signed divorce papers. "By tonight, this company has one voice," he said. Then his phone lit up. The first notification came from the harbor operations desk. Hargrave Global Logistics had been placed under heritage use review, pending verification of infrastructure permissions. Julian read it once, then again, because the language was polite enough to feel unreal. Chloe leaned closer. "Is everything okay?" He did not answer. His jaw tightened, but his voice stayed controlled when he called the harbor master. No one broke procedure for him. Evelyn had built the procedure. Downstairs, Evelyn stepped out onto the service level where the air smelled of salt, diesel, cold metal, and Atlantic wind. A line of trucks waited beyond the security gates. Cranes stood over the docks like black ribs against the water. This was not a ballroom, not a penthouse, not a stage built for flattery. This was the place where money became movement. She looked toward the entrance as workers lowered the last piece of the Vance crest from its mounting bolts. For one suspended moment, the pain arrived clean and private. Her father's symbol hung from a harness, no longer above the gate, no longer watching over the harbor he had protected. Julian had not merely betrayed a wife. He had tried to erase a lineage and decorate the emptiness with Chloe's name. Evelyn closed the manifest. Her face did not harden, it clarified. "Begin the silent boycott," she said. The senior port lawyer answered through the secure line, his tone measured. The notices were already prepared. Every Vance-controlled dock would require renewed written consent. Every Hargrave vessel approaching within miles of the harbor would be flagged for infrastructure verification. Every warehouse agreement tied to family land would freeze until legal standing was confirmed. No accusation had to be made. No threat had to be spoken. Evelyn simply withdrew permission, and the empire Julian thought he owned began floating outside the shore with nowhere lawful to land. By the time Julian reached the window, 3 vessel icons on the operations screen had turned from green to amber. His hand hovered over the glass table, no longer commanding it. Chloe stared at the screen without understanding the color change. Evelyn, below them on the dock, slid the manifest into her red leather portfolio and walked toward the harbor gate, as if leaving a marriage had only returned her to the ground that had always belonged to her. The first hour of the silent boycott did not look like revenge. It looked like compliance. Evelyn entered the temporary Vance operations room 3 floors above the service docks, placed the Midnight Navy Master Manifest on a steel table, and watched the harbor map shift from routine traffic to legal tree-off. A crimson sleeve brushed the red gilded edges as she opened the index sections Julian had never respected because they did not flatter his name. The senior port lawyer stood across from her with a folder of covenants thicker than a maritime codebook, while the harbor master reviewed berth permissions line by line. "No vessel moves on family land without family consent," Evelyn said. The sentence was not loud, but it had the weight of a gate closing. For 10 years, Julian had treated the Vance infrastructure like invisible flooring beneath his ambition. something stable, silent, and naturally available. He had spoken in boardrooms about global scale, Atlantic dominance, and billion-dollar corridors, but he had never asked who owned the docks where his empire became real. Evelyn had asked. Evelyn had documented. Evelyn had kept every clause clean enough to survive scrutiny. On the wall screen, the first Hargrave vessel slowed 8 miles offshore, carrying refrigerated medical cargo that required a confirmed cold chain transfer within a narrow window. Another ship approached from the south, stacked with consumer goods tied to a retail contract with penalty triggers measured by the hour. A third carried high-value machinery insured under terms that required secure unloading before 6 p.m. Eastern. Julian's empire was not collapsing because Evelyn attacked it. It was collapsing because he had built it on permission he had mistaken for possession. "Send the second notice to the banks," she said. The quiet assistant transmitted the infrastructure risk memorandum to every lender with exposure to Hargrave Global Logistics. The language was clinical, not emotional. Conditional access. Suspended. Birth rights under heritage review. Warehouse priority rights withdrawn. Rail easements pending verification. Cold storage no longer guaranteed. No accusation. No scandal. Just enough truth to make credit officers reread their loan covenants with colder hands. Across the harbor, Julian remained in the executive suite, trying to force reality back into the shape of his ego. His black tuxedo jacket was still perfect, but his voice had thinned when he demanded a list of alternative ports. The operations team gave him options that sounded useful until numbers entered the room. The nearest viable reroute added hundreds of miles, extra fuel, customs delays, detention fees, and missed delivery windows. A board member asked whether Hargrave Global Logistics had independent infrastructure guarantees outside Vance property. Julian looked at the screen for 1 second too long. That second answered more than any confession. Chloe sat beside him in ivory lace, her posture polished for cameras that were no longer there, and asked whether a public statement might calm investors. The room turned toward her with the quiet cruelty of professionals hearing a decorative answer to a structural disaster. She tried again, mentioning brand trust and luxury leadership. The lead banker interrupted with one question. "Can you explain the port throughput exposure?" Chloe's mouth opened, but no useful sentence came. Evelyn had designed her strategy around this exact fracture. Julian needed Chloe to look like a future. Evelyn allowed the room to discover she was a liability. By mid-afternoon, the legal pressure became financial pressure, and the financial pressure became psychological pressure. Insurance carriers requested clarification. Retail partners demanded delivery assurances. Overseas buyers invoked default language. The board asked for documents Julian had never read because Evelyn had always read them for him. In the Vance operations room, she placed a narrow red marker beside each activated clause in the manifest. One for docks, one for cranes, one for cold storage, one for rail, one for private access roads. The pattern was merciless because it was lawful. Her pain had become architecture. Her silence had become leverage. Julian had wanted to step into the light by removing the woman everyone knew was the brain of the empire, but every call he made only proved the opposite. The more he tried to command the harbor, the more the harbor asked for Evelyn. She looked through the glass toward the gate where the Vance crest lay wrapped in canvas, waiting to be restored. "Continue the lockdown," she said. "Let the contracts teach him ownership. The first mistake powerful men make is believing silence means consent, and that a woman's contribution can be erased with a single pen stroke." Julian Hargrave did not simply betray Evelyn Vance because he wanted Chloe Beaumont. That would be too simple. He betrayed Evelyn because her competence was a mirror he could no longer stand to face. Every contract she saved, every ship she routed, every crisis she solved reminded him that his crown depended on her mind. So he tried to replace intelligence with decoration, heritage with branding, and law with ego. Tell me, what does a fragile man do when he cannot become the source of power? He removes the person who reveals he never was. But power does not disappear because a husband stops saying his wife's name. Power waits in documents, in land records, in access rights, in the ground beneath his feet. Evelyn understood that. And now, she was done teaching him softly. She stood alone inside the temporary Vance command room, a glass-walled office above the docks where the harbor spread below her in hard lines of steel, water, rail, and freight. The room was not luxurious in the way Julian understood luxury. There were no ivory flowers, no velvet chairs, no flattering portraits of men pretending to own the future. There was a steel conference table, for wall screens, a secured harbor terminal, and a direct view of the Atlantic lanes that had fed the Vance family for generations. Evelyn placed the Midnight Navy Master Manifest at the center of the table, then removed her crimson silk blazer and laid it over the back of a chair like a battle flag taken out of ceremony and put to work. "Show me every partner exposed to Hargrave delays," she said. The quiet assistant brought up a matrix of shipping companies, lenders, insurers, retail buyers, cold chain clients, and port service providers. Each line represented a business Julian had once treated as captive because he believed his fleet was the empire. Evelyn saw the deeper truth. The fleet was only metal without permission to land. The senior port lawyer entered with the restored Vance crest wrapped in canvas, the same crest Julian had ordered removed for Chloe's debut sign. For one moment, Evelyn did not touch it. Her face remained composed, but something in the room lowered around her silence. 10 years of marriage had not broken her. 10 years of being underestimated had trained her to separate pain from strategy. She placed one hand on the canvas, put it back above the harbor gate before sunset. The order moved through the room with absolute finality. Then she turned to the wall screen and began building the new empire, not from revenge alone, but from replacement. She authorized direct Vance sovereignty contracts to every client willing to bypass Hargrave Global Logistics. She opened emergency berth windows for neutral carriers. She extended cold storage priority to medical shipments so no innocent cargo would be sacrificed for Julian's arrogance. She approved temporary access roads, rail slots, and warehouse transfers under Vance control. The harbor did not freeze for the world. It froze for him. That distinction mattered. Evelyn was not burning the coast to punish one man. She was proving that lawful power could be precise. By late afternoon, the first outside carrier accepted a Vance direct routing agreement. Then a second, then a third. The lead banker requested a private call and offered a credit facility secured not by Julian's reputation, but by Vance land, Vance docks, and Vance throughput capacity. Evelyn listened, reviewed the terms, and crossed out 3 predatory clauses with a red pen. "We build clean, or we do not build at all," she said. Outside, workers lifted the Vance crest back toward the harbor entrance, inch by inch, while the wrapped ivory sign meant for Chloe remained abandoned near the service fence. Evelyn watched it without satisfaction. Decoration had tried to replace legacy, and legacy had answered with paperwork, infrastructure, and discipline. When the crest locked back into place above the gate, Evelyn opened a fresh folder marked Vance Sovereignty Direct Operations. Her marriage had ended in a conference room. Her empire began at the shore. By 5:40 p.m., Vance Sovereignty Direct Operations no longer looked like an emergency response. It looked like the beginning of a cleaner kingdom. Evelyn stood at the steel conference table in her brilliant crimson silk suit, the restored Vance crest visible through the glass above the harbor gate, while 4 wall screens tracked vessel reroutes, cold storage capacity, insurance exposure, and direct client conversions in real time. She did not celebrate each new contract. She studied it. Power, to Evelyn, was never the thrill of taking something from a man. It was the discipline of building something too precise for him to steal again. "Prioritize medical cargo, food supply, and time-sensitive freight," she said. "No innocent client pays for his arrogance." The quiet assistant moved the instructions across the secured terminal, and the harbor responded with sharp efficiency. A refrigerated shipment that had been trapped under Hargrave scheduling was transferred to a neutral carrier with Vance berth approval. A retail container line was reassigned to a warehouse 5 miles inland with rail access under family easement. A machinery client accepted a temporary docking slot after Evelyn personally amended the penalty language so the buyer would not be crushed by Julian's breach. That was the difference between revenge and sovereignty. Revenge only destroys. Sovereignty decides what survives. Across Manhattan, Julian was still trying to perform control inside a room that no longer believed him. His charcoal black tuxedo had become a costume under fluorescent pressure, elegant from a distance and useless up close. Every call he made led back to the same locked door, Vance land, Vance docs, Vance access, Vance permission. Chloe Beaumont sat near the investor screen in ivory lace, pale and carefully composed, but her presence had shifted from prize to problem. A communications advisor asked whether she could explain the transition plan in a short video statement. A board member asked if she understood maritime liability. The lead banker asked if she had authority to negotiate infrastructure access. Chloe folded her hands and looked toward Julian. Julian looked away. Evelyn did not need to be in that room to expose them. She had designed a battlefield where ignorance testified against itself. In the Vance command room, the senior port lawyer placed 3 new agreements beside the Midnight Navy Master Manifest: a direct carrier license, an emergency cold chain service contract, and a lender commitment secured by Vance throughput capacity. Evelyn read every clause, crossing out vanity language and tightening operational duties until the documents became as lean as harbor steel. "No ornamental titles," she said. "Everyone who signs this must carry weight." The senior port lawyer adjusted the language without argument. By sunset, the first ship under Vance direct authority moved toward an approved berth, while 2 Hargrave vessels remained offshore, their cargo schedules bleeding value by the hour. The contrast was merciless. Evelyn's new system moved freight with lawful precision. Julian's old empire floated in place, expensive, visible, and helpless. On the lower dock, workers removed the abandoned ivory sign meant for Chloe and carried it past the security fence like a prop from a play that had closed before opening night. Evelyn watched for only a moment. The old wound tried to rise again. The image of her father's crest nearly erased, the humiliation of being called a steward in the room she had quietly saved for years. Then the harbor lights came on, one by one, reflecting against the dark water like a route map returning to life. She opened a fresh page in the manifest and wrote the first line of the new operating doctrine in red ink. "Access belongs to those who respect the ground." The quiet assistant looked at the words, then at the ships moving under Evelyn's authority. "Should I release the public statement?" Evelyn closed the manifest. "No. Let the harbor speak first." By 7 p.m., the harbor had begun choosing its ruler without a vote. Evelyn stood before the wall screens in the Vance command room, the crimson silk of her suit catching the blue light of vessel maps, while every line of freight moving through the harbor sorted itself into 2 categories: cargo with lawful access and cargo trapped behind Julian Hargrave's pride. The difference was no longer emotional. It was operational. One ship under Vance direct authority had unloaded temperature-sensitive medical supplies within its required window. Another had cleared consumer goods through a warehouse 5 miles inland before penalty time began. A third neutral carrier accepted a revised berth agreement that placed Vance sovereignty at the center of the route instead of Hargrave Global Logistics. Evelyn looked at the conversion report. Open 12 more slots. The quiet assistant moved the command through the secured terminal, and the harbor adjusted like a disciplined machine. Outside, cranes resumed work for everyone except Julian. That precision frightened the market more than a public scandal would have, because it proved the empire did not need his name to function. It needed Evelyn's permission, her systems, her land, her infrastructure discipline, and the old Vance covenants he had dismissed as decorative family history. Lenders who had ignored her for years now requested access to her operations room. Insurers asked for updated throughput estimates under Vance control. Retail buyers wanted direct agreements. Overseas clients asked whether Evelyn could stabilize Atlantic routes before midnight. She answered each one with conditions, not favors. No hidden liability. No inflated delays. No executive vanity fees. The senior port lawyer repeated her terms to every caller until the pattern became unmistakable. Evelyn was not rescuing Julian's clients for sympathy. She was teaching the market how clean power behaves. Across the water, Julian's situation narrowed by the minute. His first Hargrave vessel missed a transfer window. His second vessel faced rerouting charges. His third sat offshore while its cargo value began eroding under time clauses his own legal team had once bragged about. The lead banker requested a private emergency conference, but this time Julian was not the center of the table. He sat in his charcoal black tuxedo with a loosened collar, staring at a spreadsheet that made his title look ornamental. Chloe Beaumont sat beside him in ivory lace, scrolling through social media as luxury contacts quietly stopped responding to her posts. Earlier that morning, she had been announced as the new face of the empire. Now the empire had no shoreline. A board member asked Julian for proof of independent dock rights. His hand moved toward a folder, then stopped because there was nothing inside it that Evelyn had not already withdrawn. He tried to speak with command, but his voice thinned into procedure. "We are exploring alternatives," he said. The room heard the emptiness. Back in the Vance command room, Evelyn received the first market alert. Hargrave bonds had been downgraded for infrastructure uncertainty. Then came the second. 2 international buyers had declared potential default exposure. Then the third. A major carrier consortium wanted a direct meeting with Vance sovereignty by morning. The quiet assistant looked up from the terminal. "They are asking who has final authority." Evelyn closed the Midnight Navy Master Manifest and rested her palm on its navy cover. "Tell them the shore does." Her answer traveled faster than a press release because the harbor had already verified it. Within another hour, financial media began reporting that Hargrave Global Logistics faced a severe access crisis, while Vance-controlled docks remained active under separate authorization. Evelyn did not appear on camera. She did not need applause. On the lower dock, trucks rolled through the restored Vance gate, lights reflecting over wet steel, while workers routed freight with the confidence of people following a system that finally matched reality. Evelyn walked down from the command room and stood near the gate as a neutral carrier captain approached with a signed direct agreement. He did not flatter her. He simply handed over the document. "We are ready to move under Vance authority." Evelyn signed in red ink. At that moment, the balance of the market shifted from the man who owned ships to the woman who decided whether ships could touch land. At 9:15 p.m., Julian Hargrave learned that a billionaire can lose power while still sitting at the head of the table. The executive suite remained polished, the harbor view remained expensive, and his charcoal black tuxedo still looked like control from a distance, but every screen in front of him had turned into evidence against him. Hargrave Global Logistics was not suffering a public relations problem. It was suffering a physical reality problem. Ships could not unload. Contracts could not be honored. Lenders could not pretend collateral existed where access had been withdrawn. Julian placed both hands on the table to steady them, but his fingers still trembled against the glass. "Give me another port," he said. No one moved quickly. That was the first sign of abandonment. Earlier that morning, assistants had rushed before he finished a sentence. Board members had nodded before he finished a lie. Bankers had smiled because his empire looked too large to question. Now every person in the room waited for someone else to take responsibility for believing him. A senior advisor explained that rerouting one vessel would add more than 300 miles of ocean movement, additional fuel exposure, new customs delays, and missed delivery guarantees. Another advisor confirmed that 2 major buyers had issued formal breach notices. The lead banker's voice stayed professional, which made it worse. The credit line would not be extended without verified independent infrastructure rights. Julian stared at the document. "We have ships," he said. The banker answered carefully. "Ships are not ports." That sentence did what humiliation had not done. It stripped him down to the fear he had hidden for years. He was not afraid of losing money first. He was afraid the world would finally see that Evelyn Vance had been the structure inside the empire while he had been the name painted on the hull. Chloe Beaumont sat 3 seats away in her ivory-laced dress, her makeup perfect, her hands folded too tightly in her lap. Her phone kept lighting up with messages from social circles that had praised her that morning and distanced themselves by nightfall. A luxury magazine canceled her feature. A charity board postponed her appearance. A private club withdrew an invitation without explanation. Then the lawsuits began moving toward her. Because Julian had presented Chloe as the incoming public leader, investors now wanted to know what she knew, what she endorsed, and why she had stood beside inaccurate claims about control over port infrastructure. Her decorative role had become a legal shadow. "Julian, tell them I was not responsible," she said. He did not look at her. The silence between them was cleaner than cruelty. It was usefulness ending. Outside the windows, Hargrave vessels remained offshore, lit and stranded, expensive silhouettes against the black water. Each hour converted reputation into liability. Each missed berth converted arrogance into math. Each call Julian placed circled back to the same answer. Vance's permission was not available. By midnight, the board had removed him from emergency decision authority pending solvency review. No one shouted. No one needed to. A board member slid the resolution across the table, and Julian's hand hovered above the signature block as though his body understood before his pride did. His voice came out lower than before, almost stripped of command. "This company carries my name." The board member replied, "It no longer carries your credit." Across the harbor, Evelyn stood inside the Vance command room beneath clean white operational lights, reviewing the final risk map with the senior port lawyer. Her crimson suit had not lost its sharpness, but her face held no triumph. She understood collapse better than Julian did. Collapse was not a man falling to his knees. Collapse was when the people who once benefited from his illusion quietly protected themselves from it. A lender withdrew. A partner denied prior confidence. A journalist questioned ownership. A mistress became a witness. A board stopped pretending. Evelyn marked the final Hargrave exposure line in red ink and closed the Midnight Navy Master Manifest. "Keep essential cargo moving," she said. "Let his empire carry only what belongs to him." By 2 a.m., emergency default notices and creditor filings began. By dawn, Hargrave Global Logistics was no longer an empire in motion. It was a stranded fleet, a frozen credit structure, and a man in a black tuxedo staring at a harbor that had never belonged to him. By 8:30 a.m., Julian Hargrave came to the harbor gate not as a king returning to command, but as a man trying to negotiate with the ground beneath him. The restored Vance crest stood above the entrance, heavy, ancestral, and impossible to mistake, while the abandoned ivory sign for Chloe Beaumont lay inside a disposal cart near the service fence, wrapped in plastic like an expensive mistake. Evelyn Vance waited 20 feet beyond the security line in her brilliant crimson silk suit, the Midnight Navy Master Manifest held against her side, calm enough to make every legal notice around her feel inevitable. Julian arrived in the same charcoal black tuxedo he had worn the day before, but the fabric no longer carried authority. It carried the exhaustion of a man who had spent the night learning that ships without land are only floating debt. Chloe stood behind him in ivory lace, pale under the harbor lights, no longer framed by champagne and boardroom glass, but by steel rails, container stacks, warning signs, and attorneys holding liability folders. No one invited them inside. That was the first verdict. Julian looked past Evelyn toward the active docks where neutral carriers now moved under Vance authorization, their containers transferred with disciplined speed while Hargrave vessels remained offshore beyond the approved channel. He tried to step forward, but the harbor master raised one hand and pointed to the access boundary. Julian stopped. The smallness of that pause did more damage than any public insult. "Evelyn," he said, and her name came out stripped of its old entitlement. She opened the manifest on a portable steel table placed between them. The senior port lawyer laid down 3 documents: emergency access denial, lender default acknowledgement, and asset seizure initiation. Julian stared at the papers as if the words had betrayed him by being readable. "You cannot lock me out of my own empire," he said. Evelyn turned one page. The red gilded edge caught the morning light. "Your empire used my family's docks, my family's rail easements, my family's cold storage priority, and my family's harbor covenants." She looked at him directly. "You own vessels, Julian. You never owned the shore." Chloe took one step forward, her voice careful, almost brittle, asking whether her personal exposure could be separated from the company announcement. The senior port lawyer answered without raising his tone, because she had accepted public leadership representation during a material infrastructure misstatement. Her role would be reviewed by claimants. Chloe looked to Julian for protection. Julian looked at the manifest instead. Usefulness had ended, and the room between them knew it. Evelyn did not soften. She had been softened for 10 years by people who mistook restraint for availability. Julian's hand moved toward the table, then withdrew when he saw the ownership page marked with Vance seals older than his company. His fingers trembled once against his black sleeve. "I built this," he said, but there was no force left in it. Evelyn closed the manifest halfway, leaving one page visible. "No, Julian. You stood in front of what I built and called the shadow yours." Around them, the harbor continued moving. That was the cruelty of reality. It did not pause to validate his version of the story. He lowered his voice. "You wanted revenge. Evelyn's expression remained cold, elegant, almost judicial. I wanted accuracy. Then she gave him the sentence that reached the wound he had hidden beneath every speech, every tuxedo, every false claim of being self-made. You never wanted to own the empire, Julian. You only wanted the world to stop knowing it was standing on my family's ground. His mouth opened, but no command came out. The silence that followed was not theatrical. It was structural. The banker stepped forward and handed Julian the final notice of credit termination. The board member confirmed emergency removal proceedings. The journalist beyond the gate lifted a recorder, but Evelyn did not perform for it. She signed the final lockdown authorization in red ink and gave the document to the senior port lawyer. Release lawful cargo. Isolate Hargrave exposure. Proceed with seizure review. Julian watched the paper leave her hand, as if watching the last bridge pull away from him. Chloe stepped back from him by a careful inch, then another. Evelyn picked up the manifest and walked through the gate under the restored Vance crest, while Julian remained outside, dressed like power, blocked by the infrastructure he had tried to erase. And here is the truth Evelyn's story leaves behind. True power is not being the captain of a ship. It is being the one who decides if the ship is allowed to reach the shore. Betrayal always carries a price, but the deepest price is not paid in headlines, divorce papers, or lost money. It is paid when illusion meets structure. Julian Hargrave believed love made Evelyn Vance available, marriage made her replaceable, and silence made her weak. That is the fatal arrogance of people who confuse proximity to power with ownership of power. They stand beside a brilliant woman for years, benefit from her discipline, feed on her credibility, and then convince themselves the throne was theirs all along. But betrayal does not destroy a woman who knows her foundation. It only clarifies what must never be shared again. Evelyn did not win because Julian regretted losing her. She won because she remembered that her name, her mind, her heritage, and her ground existed before he arrived. And by the next afternoon, freedom no longer looked like escape. It looked like command. Evelyn stood on the deck of a Vance command ship moving through the Atlantic wind, her red coat billowing behind her with the same fierce color as the suit Julian had tried to dismiss in the conference room. Manhattan's harbor stretched behind her in steel, water, cranes, and disciplined motion, no longer confused about who held authority. The restored Vance crest shone above the gate. Neutral carriers moved through approved berths. Medical cargo cleared cold storage. Rail lines carried freight inland under clean contracts. The world had not stopped because Julian fell. It had corrected its route. On the deck table before Evelyn lay the final acquisition packet prepared by the senior port lawyer. Seized Hargrave assets, distressed vessel rights, warehouse claims, and equipment liens that banks no longer wanted to carry. The purchase price had been typed with brutal simplicity, exactly $1. Not $1 million. Not one symbolic settlement hidden behind polite language. Exactly $1. The symbolic purchase price for assets no lender wanted to hold after the empire had been stripped of borrowed ground, borrowed credibility, and borrowed intelligence. Evelyn read every page before signing. She did not rush the moment, because she no longer lived inside anyone else's emergency. A lead banker stood nearby, careful and respectful now, explaining that the transfer would allow Vance sovereignty to absorb useful assets without inheriting Julian's vanity structure. Evelyn crossed out one clause that protected old executive privileges and initialed the correction in red ink. No ghosts in the new system, she said. The senior port lawyer accepted the revision. Far across the harbor, Julian's former flagship vessel waited to be renamed, not as an act of cruelty, but as an act of accuracy. Chloe Beaumont's name had already vanished from invitation lists, advisory boards, and luxury circles that once welcomed her as a future queen. Julian's name remained only in legal filings, creditor notes, and articles asking how a billionaire logistics tycoon failed to understand the land beneath his own docks. Evelyn looked toward the shoreline, not with hatred, but with distance. That was the final freedom. Not needing his apology, not needing his ruin to warm her, not needing the marriage to explain her value. She signed the $1 acquisition document, closed the pen, and let the wind lift the edge of her red coat as the command ship turned toward open water. Behind her, the harbor kept moving under Vance authority. Ahead of her, the Atlantic widened without asking permission from anyone. This story is a fictional narrative created for entertainment, reflection, and educational purposes. Any resemblance to real people, places, or events is purely coincidental.